So, welcome to the show, Steve. Welcome to Lancefield on the Line. Great to have you here today. It's an absolute pleasure and privilege. Today, we're going to be talking about entrepreneurship, ambidexterity, startups and corporates. And of course, as we do on this show, your own reflections on your impact and your career and indeed the future, what it holds for you. So, welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me, David.
Pleasure. So let's get stuck in. We've got loads of topics, and I'm scratching my head knowing where to start, given everything you've achieved and done in your life. But let's start here. Let's get straight to it. If you think about ideation, incubation, and scaling, what is the hardest activity out of all of them?
Starting.
Great answer. Great answer.
So it's for some people, having ideas come natural. In fact, for me, I never realized there was a stage called ideation that actually people got trained on and went through exercises, because my problem was trying to figure out how to down select. But other people were great at at other parts of execution, that is incubation or customer discovery. And so if you think about innovation as kind of an end-to-end process, all the way from ideation to deployment, all parts of them are necessary, and different parts are necessary in the different life cycles of a new venture, regardless of whether it's inside of a startup or a large organization.
Okay, absolutely. And I guess one thing I've seen is some people try to stay too long because it's their baby, when actually they should either step back, bring other people in. So it's knowing what you're really good at sometimes, and then bringing friends and allies along to complement your skills.
Well, it's very funny that you say that. Early on, I realized that at least my definition of a startup was quite different than others. My definition of a startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. And it's interesting to parse that, because a goal of a startup is not to become a startup. A goal of a startup is to become a large corporation or a large internal venture or something else. And it's designed to search. Sometimes you think it's designed to build something, but first it's designed to search for product market fit. And then you've achieved product market fit when you have a repeatable and scalable business model or sales model.
Yes.
And then if you realize, still riffing on what you said, different people are good for different parts of that journey. Some people could take it all the way through, but some people are great in the search phase. Some people are great at the growth phase, and some people are wonderful at the turning it into $100 million or $1 billion company. And what we get wrong is, the literature and the stories all kind of talk about the founder who took it to $N billion, when that might not be what most people are capable of doing.
Yes, indeed. I mean, you talked about search there. You've been critical of, I guess, organisations, particularly bigger corporates, who confuse search with execution. They don't search; they're just refining or doing. Tell me a bit more about that distinction.
Well, there's a couple of things. One is every company at its beginning was a startup, right? If you really think about it, if you're in a large organization, way back in the past, there were a couple of founders who found what we call product market fit. That is, they were delivering something that people wanted and needed. But as companies get larger, the people who create things, unfortunately, become secondary to the people who build process, because corporations need process, procedures, KPIs, etc., for scale. And there's nothing wrong with that until you realize that all of a sudden the process people have overwhelmed and kind of now making the rules from the innovation folks. And that's okay when you're a dominant player or the market isn't changing or whatever. You could, in fact, grow quite consistently until there's a inflection point or disruption in the marketplace, whether it's a technology disruption or economic change or regulatory change. And then all of a sudden you realize you've kind of beaten that DNA of innovation out of your company and you no longer have it. And then you're scrambling to either acquire or build or do something else, or else you're going to be on that downward trajectory. And companies have life cycles. The problem is now in the 21st century, the life cycles of companies are dramatically shorter than they were in the 20th. Yes. Not because CEOs are dumber, but the rate of change and the and the disruptions on multiple axes have occurred. But really, the process of building continuous innovation inside of companies really hasn't been adopted at that same speed.
Given what you say there, Steve, I'm curious about what you think the prospects are for corporate venture capital, which is an area that at the moment, at least in my purview, seems to have a lot of interest, a lot of activity. Where do you think it could go, and what will it take to make it successful if you are in a corporate trying to, if you like, use that vehicle to spur on innovation and growth?
Well, typically when you use the phrase corporate venture capital, it's not used to describe internal investment. It's typically used to describe external investment for things that may or may not be of interest and parallel to the company's interest and trajectory. Um, Historically, corporate venture capital has been a pretty cyclical business. In hot times, when companies are flush with cash, they set up corporate VC funds, and in tough times, that's one of the first things that get jettisoned, and then the cycle repeats. The irony is, of course, that it might be equally productive to be investing in your own people and your own internal projects. But almost in every company I've looked at, and again, there are a few exceptions, um, that these kind of sit in silos. You might have internal innovation groups, but you have corporate venture capital, corporate M&A, corporate strategy, all sitting kind of separate from each other, um, which just seems to me to be ludicrous, but that's how most of them are organized.
And the picture you just paint there, we often see what you've called elegantly and eloquently innovation theatre. Looks good, sounds good, but rarely yields much in terms of output and impact. If you're in the middle of one of those performances and you have a real, like they listen to you and listen to your wisdom, and you think, I've got to get out of it, where do you start? How do you dismantle that theatre?
Well, let me just remind the rest of your listeners and viewers is that innovation theater is when you, inside of a large organization, set up an incubator and accelerator and have great demos and, coffee cups and posters and lanyards and bring your dogs to work. But the output, that is the things that get delivered to the field, whether they're products or services for companies or for government, is almost zero. And the reason why is you didn't do the hard stuff first. The hard stuff is building an end-to-end process that focuses on rapid deployment of things outside the building, not rapid demos inside the building. And now, obviously, at times you need rapid demos to move things from stage to stage to prove that you've found product market fit or that you've solved some of the tough technical problems. But typically in a corporation, the problem of building an internal innovation ecosystem is all about channel conflict, all about resource allocation, all about budgets and dollars. Those things are much harder to kind of fix, and almost always the head of innovation does not appear to the VP of sales or a VP of manufacturing or a VP of whatever. It's some report somewhere down the food chain, and by that you've kind of relegated innovation to kind of a theatrical performance rather than a revenue generator, or more importantly, a place to actually move your company to when the future arrives. Because innovation always occurs at the edges and eventually moves into the center. And if you are not doing this, your competitors, or nowadays a startup, is going to do that. By the way, who ever thought in the 20th century that startups would have more capital, at least for R&D, than major corporations? But in this world of, at least until now, flush cash, a lot of startups were able to spend money and take losses in no way that a corporation could. And if you're not prepared to figure out how to deal with that type of disruption, I would just be making sure that your pay is based on the last quarter, not the next 5 years.
Yes. You talked there about spending time on the edges of the business and obviously out of the building. I'm curious about. I looked at one of your many brilliant quotes where you talk about, hey, if you're a leadership team, as smart as you are not as smart as the collective intelligence of your customer base. So, apart from getting out of the building, getting out to the edges of the organisation and beyond, what are the big shifts in leadership teams? The executive committees that talk a good game around customers, around innovation. What practically do they need to do beyond, if well, is it that? Is it spending time out of the building, virtually or physically? Is it spending more time with customers? What do they need to focus on?
Well, at the highest possible level, both the board of directors and the exec staff need to have a management structure that has innovation and execution in parallel and in tension and in cooperation. Two professors, Charles O'Reilly and Michael Tushman, wrote a great set of books on this. One of them, the last one, called Lead and Disrupt, about what they coined the ambidextrous organization. And people have talked about this for decades, but instead of being a nice to have, I think it's essential. Once you understand that organizations need to be obviously executing your current business models, but now creating and exploring and eventually being able to exploit new ones continually, not as one-off heroics, you'll tend to realize, oh, good, we have execution processes of how we launch existing products or deal with existing customers or existing sales channel. But where's the parallel organization that's doing high-speed customer discovery, building minimum viable products, taking risks about channel, dealing with channel, the inevitable brand and channel conflicts that will come. And instead of having those as individual food fights, kind of understanding that is something that needs to just be a continual process. That's when you have a true ambidextrous organization.
I'm going to build on that theme a bit more and talk a bit deeper about the concept of entrepreneurship, which you spent your life pioneering, and the balance between nurture and nature and nurture.
Pioneering is a shorthand for screwing up a lot. I just want to remind your audience, I was a practitioner for the first half of my career, so I could talk about it in the second half of my career. The box score after 8 startups were, there were 4 IPOs, but there are 2 craters so deep they have their own iridium layer. So it gives me a couple of qualifications to actually talk about kind of some of the ground truth of getting your fingernails dirty about building innovation processes. And I've done them for governments and large corporations as well. So I kind of laugh when you say thinking about it. It is, well, yes, now I get to think about it, but only after I screwed it up.
Yeah. You've got the scars. You've got the scars as well as the successes. No, absolutely. But I'm curious about, if you think about developing entrepreneurs, whether in communities in the wider society as well as in companies of different sizes and shapes, the question that sometimes comes up is, to what degree is it nature versus nurture? In other words, how much of it is genetics versus the conditions? And of course, it's a bit of both, I imagine. But what do you think the balance is in the ups and downs of your own career and your own experiences and the people you've interacted with? What's the balance between the two, would you say?
I think we'll understand that answer, nature versus nurture, when we have the answer for the rest of human society about, is it how your parents raised you or is it your genetics? But one of the things, and I'm going to slightly dodge the question, but make a couple of observations. First of all, if you think about a founding team, and I say team because almost all new ventures, whether startup or internal, are done by more than one person, at least the successful ones have an interesting combination of characteristics. There's the innovator, that is the inventor of the technology, but they're almost always coupled with an entrepreneur, someone capable of either in a startup, in fact, here, the example is Jobs and Wozniak, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, Elon Musk and J.B. Straubel at Tesla. One is the outward-facing person you hear about all the time because they're, creating the reality distortion field about raising money and convincing customers and whatever. And the other one is the one who's actually shoveling the coal into the engine to make it work, because they created the innovation, but without each other, neither one of them would have been successful. Right. There wouldn't have been a Tesla without J.B. Straubel, and there wouldn't have been, a Tesla for sure without Elon Musk. The same goes with Apple and Microsoft, and you can make the entire list. Inside of a corporation, you find the same type of combination. In the beginning, there's someone with an insight, but then there's someone who knows how to work the bureaucratic, machinery to get something to happen. that until there's an ambidextrous organization, requires heroics and getting buy-in and figuring out who the saboteurs are, etc. And then in both cases, you add more skills as you go further down that pipeline. Maybe you need human interface design, maybe you need regulatory advice, maybe you need whatever. And when you build an innovation process, you kind of understand that it usually starts with at least those two skills, and then you need to layer on as you get further down the validation track. Now, to answer your question, whether you could, but if you really think about it, I've started with two different people, the innovator and the entrepreneur, and so now your question is, could I turn the innovator, the scientist, into a entrepreneur, and could I turn the entrepreneur into a research scientist? And the answer is probably not, but I could certainly make them appreciate and respect each other's skills and teach them how to work together in a way that they never would have figured out themselves. It's why we created the National Science Foundation Innovation Corps, of how to train principal investigators in U.S. universities and in the U.K. and Australia now, how to, in fact, commercialize their technology, when they knew nothing about commerce or companies or company building. It's not that we expect them to quit their university jobs, but we now make them realize what it takes to get their postdocs and graduate students who don't want to be academics to build companies. And it, in fact, changes the trajectory of commercialization of science. At least it has in the U.S., and we're now in our second decade. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did, absolutely. It was a great answer, and I think you answered as much of it, I think, as you can. Hey, I mean, some of these questions are, as you say, they're deeper than entrepreneurship in terms of nature and nurture. But it prompts a recollection of a number of discussions I've had with executives, mid to senior executives, where at some point in their career, somebody, their boss typically, will say to them, be more entrepreneurial, get more commercial. And that's not where they've grown up, how they've grown up. They've perhaps been process-driven people. And I guess the reflection I take from what you say there, Steve, is you have to train them. You have to encourage them. And I spend a lot of time around the strategy area as well as innovation. And a number of people make big strategic decisions, big innovation decisions as well. And you say to them, well, how are you making those decisions? How do you go about it? And they haven't been trained. They haven't been given the tools. There's a gaps.
Yeah. So let me give one more spin on your great question. Founders at their very core are closer to artists than any other profession. They see things that other people don't. They hear things that other people don't. 90% of the time or more, they're actually hallucinating and they think they're visionaries. But every once in a while, a masterpiece comes out. The great analogy is when people visited Michelangelo's studio and saw a 12-foot block of marble. He said to them, this is the most beautiful statue ever created. And they went, it's a 12-foot block of marble. And he said, come back in 3 years. And they came back and there was the Pieta. And they said, well, how did you do that? And he said, I just removed the stone around it. Well, that's what founders do. Founders have that complete vision in their head. And then, in fact, remove the stone around it. Now, here's the thing about innovators versus artists, is that we realize that everybody can't be an artist. But in almost every country in the world, we've realized there's value to the society to teaching art appreciation at the youngest possible age. We teach children how to fingerprint or how to make ashtrays, or nowadays not ashtrays, I don't know what else they make now, but get their hands dirty and whatever. And out of that, people tend to self-select and say, you mean writing stories is a job? I could actually do that, or drawing cartoons or whatever. And in fact, if you think about the equivalent, we need to train everybody about entrepreneurial and innovation appreciation. And out of that will rise the people who actually raise their hand and say, I can't imagine doing anything else in my life than this. We've not gotten to that point. But just imagine a company started doing that. You'd have a huge competitive advantage, because people would, in fact, self-select and go, you mean I could actually do this inside my company, and there's a path to create products and services where instead of just turning the crank? Would be amazing.
Yeah, it'd be quite a radical shift for a apprenticeship or a graduate recruitment program, where you typically focus on technical skills and sometimes presentational skills, and then suddenly you flick a switch when you get promoted and it's like, go and sell. go and innovate. It's like, and some people love it and they can do it, but most, rabbits and headlights comes
Right.
to mind. Just going back, you talked there about your, I think it's 8 startups you were involved in different shapes and form, and the craters as well as the successes. If you were to make another career shift and start one again, just imagine that as a scenario, whether that's realistic or not. What one thing would you do differently this time around, yourself personally?
Well, if I knew about the lean methodology that we created, I probably could have done it in 4 startups rather than 8. I mean, seriously, in the 20th century, innovation and entrepreneurship was a craft. Everybody kind of, created their own tools and their own, kind of investors and others said, well, startups are nothing more than smaller versions of large companies, so do everything they did. It wasn't until my work and Osterwalder's work and Eric Ries's work when we discovered, no, that's fundamentally as wrong as you could get. Startups do something very different, right? They search for business models while large organizations are executing them. And the customer development methodology, get out of the building MVPs, et cetera, are all built on that distinction. And now, 20 years later, we have a whole set of management tools and stack that differentiate the two. So I guess number one is I'd be using lean methodologies to be a lot more efficient for resources and time. The other is, and I kind of figured this out later in life, is that you got to decide at some point who you serve. Is it you work to live or do you live to work? Or for me, ultimately, I realized that everybody at some point in their life needs to serve God, country, community, family, in addition to just making a living. And so at both ends of my life, I made some choices to serve, country, community, and
Yes.
obviously my family in the middle, and threw in a little of God in there. But it, I probably would have wished I had spent a little more time earlier on. So my career started serving in the U.S. military, and then now it's kind of trended back to government and national service again. So those are some of the things. And again, when you're a rapacious and relentless entrepreneur like I was, you push people sometimes past their limits. And I wish I would have understood that everybody's limits were not mine. And that's the hindsight from age. Probably not wisdom, but just hindsight for age. So those are the 3 things.
Mm.
Using lean methodologies. 2, understanding the value of service, and then 3, understanding that other people's limits are not the same as yours.
Mm. I appreciate you sharing that, Steve, and all those different dimensions. Let me just pick up on one of those. I mean, companies now are focusing more, prioritizing more on wider concepts of value, of impact, beyond shareholder value, the responsible capitalism debate that's going on. Now, there's many ways you can do that, of course, and what that means in terms of your impact in society and the communities you serve, and how far you go to tackle the societal challenges that we face, for example, the environment. I'm curious to explore how much, if any, that changes the approach, the customer development approach, the lean startup approach that you've pioneered. Is it the same process but different goals, or how does it shift, if any, the overall application of the approach?
Sure. I mean, in the business model canvas, we could just simply add, another customer segment if we wanted to, community, country, society, et cetera, and
Mm.
figure out what those impacts were. And then you have to adjudicate between revenue goals and profit goals and cost goals and competitive goals. I've seen this happen way back earlier in the 20th century. If one group of companies decide to serve society and the others are rapacious and relentless competitors, they're going to kick your butt from here to Sunday.
Mm.
So unless there's some leveling up by government regulation that kind of says, here's the minimum required, you could put yourself at an immense competitive disadvantage while trying to do the right thing. And that's, I think that's broken, honestly.
Mm.
The Chicago School of Economics of Darwinian capitalism, I think we've run that experiment for 30, 40 years. And it's certainly created a ton of innovation. And I'm a huge capitalist. It's created some, wonderful change and made more billionaires and created more wealth. but I'm not sure it's been great for society overall if we decided to look at social impacts of technology and look at the growing divide between the rich and the poor. Um, I think you have to ask those questions of what happens when you run unfettered capitalism without any rules. Um,
Mm,
and
mm.
again, there's now enough data to at least have that conversation. And of course, the people who own the money also own the PR. So,
Yes,
so
yes.
they're willing to bury the they're willing to bury the story because it's great making money. And trust me, I'm a huge. I would not want to slow that down, but I would want to keep asking the question. Um, okay, so what's the score? Now that we're 30, 40 years into Chicago School of Economics and trickle down and all that, how's it working out? Um,
Mm,
and again, for those on the top, it's working out great. And for those on the bottom, I'm not sure that's the right answer. So
mm, mm.
I'm not even sure I answered your question, but
No, I think you did. No, I think it's a great answer. And you talked about governments there. Governments around the world, national governments, regional governments, look on at Silicon Valley with considerable envy, and some have tried to pilot their own versions of it, rightly or wrongly. What, in an imaginary sense, if you were speaking to one of those governments that was trying to emulate or learn from Silicon Valley, what would you say to them?
well, Silicon Valley itself was a historical accident. It wasn't created by design. It was created by a single professor. In fact, here where I'm sitting, probably 100 yards from here in Stanford University, uh, who was trying to um, help the United States during the Cold War by commercializing microwaves and electronics, and turned Stanford into the one of the leading universities for technology. Uh, but that was driven by immense government funding and again turning a university into what we call an outward-facing university rather than just a universities tend to be inward-facing.
Yes.
Um, but the models I think are no longer Silicon Valley. I'd look at Herzliya, outside of Tel Aviv. I'd look at Singapore keeps reinventing itself every decade or so. Did a good job. I'd look at the establishment of New York and now probably Austin as in the United States has
Mm,
designed innovation clusters and potentially Miami about what happens when individuals and local governments decide to make a push for it. Um, I'd read Annalise Saxenian's book called Regional Advantage to understand why Silicon Valley passed Boston in the 70s and 80s in the United States because of culture. Believe it or not, just because of culture. Um, think about why Chile's entrepreneurial cluster failed and Finland's took a long time to kind of take off. And I mean, there's some great, and of course, China. The Chinese MOST program, which stood up, I don't know, 12 entrepreneurial clusters, and three of them have hit it out of the park. Northwest Beijing, Pearl River Valley, and I think Shenzhen, um, and others in China. So there are a lot. Innovation used to be a Silicon Valley phenomenon. We've kind of democratized that. There's still probably only a handful of places you could raise hundreds of millions of dollars, but entrepreneurship is now everywhere. Um, thanks
absolutely.
to the internet and thanks to Amazon Web Services making computing a utility, and thanks to the standard methodologies now that we have, Lean and others, take your pick, of how to build startups. Are now instead of having to have a coffee with people, you now can have too much information to figure out how to do that.
Yes.
Podcasts like yours. Um,
Indeed.
did I answer your
Indeed.
question, David?
Absolutely. I appreciate you asking if you did, but you absolutely did. It's a brilliant conversation. As we draw to a close, I'm sensitive to your busy schedule. You've covered a huge amount of ground in your entrepreneurial efforts, your practice, your teaching, speaking, writing, and so forth. What are the big unanswered questions you'd really like to go after in the field of entrepreneurship and innovation?
Wow. Uh, do we have 3 hours? It's
I think I do, but probably not you. But
it's well, I think one of the real interesting things is there are great research labs all across the world, United States, other countries, and yet those have not been the output of great commercial technologies. And that is, we have world-class innovators, but they don't tend to have world-class entrepreneurs, right? That's what they hire great scientists and do great research. Um, yet the output is not commensurate with what we're investing in them and what we get from commercial activities. So that's one. Second is, I alluded to this earlier. Given unfettered capitalism and given the willingness to VCs to invest in anything, including things like Apple, SpaceX, and Tesla, which have been, I think, unmitigated good, and to other things like Juul and Facebook, which is the Purdue Pharma of social media. You know, how do you kind of balance that without strangling innovation in its crib? As I said, I'm a huge fan of innovation, huge fan of responsible venture capital, but left by itself, almost like every industry that says we don't need any regulation, tends to devolve to the lowest common denominator. I've seen this a million times. It's like, oh, not us. We don't need. We do a good job. No, you don't. But how do you do that in a way that actually enhances the things that are great for society and humanity as a whole, without shutting down the flow of dollars? And so how do you do those with carrots, not sticks? And I think it's going to take a light touch but some thoughtful people to figure out how to do that, because we're not on a trajectory that's been healthy, I think, for anybody, except for the few that's creamed those billions of dollars on the top. Good for them, but as I said, how do we make a more equitable and just society should also be an outcome for all the innovation and investment we do.
I agree. Yeah. My final question, on an upbeat note, would be if you were talking with an up-and-coming entrepreneur of an early age, perhaps a school kid or somebody just starting off, they had an ambition to be an entrepreneur. They'd obviously read your work, heard about you, admired you, as all of us do. What would be the one thing you'd say to them?
Well, it's what I say to all my students. It's being an entrepreneur is the world's worst job. It's miserable. It is exhausting. It's going to cost you relationships. It'll cost you years of your life. The odds are whatever you're going to do isn't going to work and probably is a very bad idea. So it's the world's worst job, but it's the world's best calling. That is, if you're called to do this, if you can imagine doing nothing else, it's just something you need to get out of your system because you have something in your head. You don't care what your friends say. You don't care for God's sake, do this. But don't do it because you think your friends are doing it or you think it's cool or whatever, because it's miserable. But it's miserable in the way that the climbing Mount Everest is miserable. It's trying to go to the moon or something else. It's the best journey if that's what you want to do. We're at the right time in the world where capital is there. Society kind of now views it as a great journey and great things to do, and most places will be supportive. So if you're called, answer the calling.
What a great answer! How candid, how honest. Not quite what I was expecting, but that was fantastic. Steve, we've covered a huge amount of ground in a short amount of time. I'm sensitive to your schedule. I know you're a hugely busy man. I'm very grateful for such a stimulating, enriching conversation. So thank you. And I'll close it here by saying that was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. If you've enjoyed this conversation, as I hope you have as much as I have, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel and to the podcast. You can get alerted to more content. And please do check out the other interviews in the series. Thank you again, Steve.
Thanks for having me, David.